Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And I'm Holly Fry.
Over the last 8 years of working on this show, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, New York has come up in a lot of my work. Research into the Tulsa Massacre referenced documents in the Schomburg collections. Research into Red Summer included one of the center's online exhibitions. When I researched Shirley Chisholm, that referenced an interview in the Schomburg Center's oral history tape collection. A while back, we interviewed John B. King Jr. about the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He took that document on a 7-city tour that started at the Schomburg Center. So I've personally used the Schomburg Center's online resources, and then the center is also just all over the footnotes and the papers that I have read for this show. I just put the word Schomburg into the folder where I have a ton of stuff saved, and it was like, blah, here's 35 documents that all have the word Schomburg in them somewhere. So honestly, I'm really embarrassed that it has taken me this long to wonder, wait, who is Schomburg? And that happened thanks to stumbling across the name Arturo Alfonso Schomburg in another context and then wondering, is that the same person that the Schomburg Center is named after? It was the same person. He was an Afro-Puerto Rican activist and collector, and Jamaican-American historian and journalist Joel Augustus Rogers nicknamed him the Sherlock Holmes of Negro history. Having researched his life and work now, I'm just really annoyed that his name was not immediately familiar to me the very first time I ever heard of the Schomburg Center. He is far less well-known than a lot of his contemporaries from the Harlem Renaissance are today. So we're going to try to rectify that a little bit with this episode.
Arturo Alfonso Schomburg was born on January 24th, 1874, in what's now the Santurce neighborhood of San Juan, Puerto Rico. His mother was Maria Josefa, a freeborn woman from St. Croix who was a midwife and a laundress. His father is often cited as Carlos Frederico Schomburg, who was born in Puerto Rico and had German ancestry. Arturo's parents were not married, and it doesn't seem that he ever met or was legally acknowledged by his father. Arturo also had a younger sister named Dolores.
At the time, Puerto Rico was a Spanish colony. And although there were schools, there was no free public education system accessible to everyone yet. And most of the schools that did exist charged tuition. It's possible that Schomburg spent some time at one of these schools, although the records that could have confirmed that were destroyed when the United States invaded Puerto Rico in 1898. It seems that most of Schomburg's education was more informal, so things like clubs and study groups and self-study at libraries.
But he described one of the experiences that had a particular impact on him as happening in a 5th grade classroom. They did not learn about any Black figures when studying history, and he asked the teacher if Black people had a history. And she said no, so he decided that one day he would prove her wrong.
At one point, Schomburg's mother returned to St. Croix, so he spent some time there while growing up as well. But a lot of his more formative experiences took place in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rican journalist Jose Julian Acosta was one of Schomburg's mentors and had a huge influence on him. Acosta had been part of the abolition movement before the Spanish Assembly abolished slavery in Puerto Rico in 1873. That was just the year before Schomburg was born.
Another big influence was Salvador Brau. Like Schomburg, Brau was an autodidact, and in spite of being self-taught, he went on to be Puerto Rico's official historian. Brau's work in history also included the contributions of Black people when many other histories did not.
Schomburg eventually became an apprentice at a print shop in San Juan, and at the age of 17, he moved to New York City. There aren't really any details documented anywhere of what led him to make this decision, and especially to go apparently by himself. He arrived there on April 17th, 1891, carrying some letters of introduction. These included one from Puerto Rican nationalist Jose Gonzalez Font, who was his boss at the print shop, and from tabaqueros, or cigar workers in Puerto Rico. He lived in New York for most of the rest of his life after this, moving from Manhattan to Harlem and then to Brooklyn.
When Schomburg arrived in New York, the Puerto Rican immigrant community in the United States was quite small, and the idea of a Puerto Rican racial or ethnic identity had not really evolved yet. That started happening more in the 1930s after more people started moving from the island to the continental U.S. But the Cuban immigrant community was larger, particularly in Tampa, Florida, and in New York City.
People had moved from Cuba to the United States at this point for a number of reasons. One was the 10 Years' War, which had spanned from 1868 to 1878. Like Puerto Rico, Cuba was a Spanish colony, and the 10 Years' War was an uprising that's generally marked as the beginning of the Cuban independence movement. People fled this violence and instability, or they were exiled because of their involvement. Tariffs also made it a lot more profitable for companies to import tobacco to the United States rather than importing finished cigars from Cuba. So cigar makers built factories in Florida and New York, and then they hired cigar makers from Cuba to work at them.
When Schomburg arrived in New York, the first community he found was among Cuban tabaqueros in Manhattan. He described his own identity as Afro-Puerto Rican, which was a Cuban term for Black Puerto Ricans. And many of the tabaqueros were politically very active, continuing to advocate for Cuban independence and providing money and supplies to support a potential armed uprising against Spanish colonial rule. Many Cuban activists also extended their work to include Puerto Rico, since Cuba and Puerto Rico were Spain's two remaining colonies in the Caribbean.
Some of the first connections Schomburg made in New York were with Afro-Cuban activist Rafael Serra and with Puerto Rican Flor Berga, and both of them were deeply involved in the independence movements for Spain's Caribbean colonies. He also became a friend and collaborator with Cuban revolutionary Jose Marti.
Along with other activists, Schomburg and Serra co-founded Las Dos Antillas, or the Two Islands, on April 3, 1892. This organization contributed money, medicine, and weapons to independence fighters on both islands. Schomburg served as the organization's secretary. He also traveled to New Orleans, which was another locus of Cuban independence activity, in 1892, and joined the Puerto Rican section of the Cuban Revolutionary Party.
In addition to his work in the independence movement, Schomburg also taught Spanish while taking night classes at a high school and studying English. He joined a predominantly Spanish-speaking Masonic lodge called El Sol de Cuba, number 38, in 1892. This lodge was affiliated with the Prince Hall Masons, which was established as a branch of Freemasonry for Black Americans in 1784. Schomburg had become a leader in this lodge by 1910. And then he also worked at a variety of different jobs, including being an elevator operator, a bellhop, and a messenger.
On June 30th, 1895, Schomburg married Elizabeth Hatcher, who was known as Bessie, and she was a Black woman from Virginia. They would go on to have 3 children, Maximo Gomez, Arturo Alfonso Jr., and Kingsley Garionex. Elizabeth died in 1900, at which point their children went to live with her family in Virginia.
An armed uprising started in Cuba in 1895. And in 1897, amid active fighting in Cuba, Spain applied the rights of Spanish citizenship to both Cuba and Puerto Rico, including giving men over the age of 25 the right to vote. And then on November 25th of that year, Spain also gave Puerto Rico the right to self-government, with the first elections under that new system held in March of 1898.
The ongoing conflict between Cuba and Spain was also sparking tensions between Spain and the United States. Spain's efforts to put down the Cuban uprising were widely covered and sometimes sensationalized in the U.S. press. Demands for the U.S. to intercede in Cuba grew after the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898. By April, Spain and the U.S. were at war, and this conflict is often called the Spanish-American War, but since the U.S. was entering an ongoing conflict between Spain and Cuba, it is also called the Spanish-Cuban-American War.
Yes, occasionally people will also include the Philippines in that, since the Philippines was involved with all of this and had its own outside the scope of this podcast stuff happening. So this war formally ended with the Treaty of Paris on December 10th, 1898. And under the terms of this treaty, Cuba became independent, while Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. That means that Puerto Rico's time as an autonomous island had really been pretty short-lived. Obviously, this is the absolute thinnest of overviews of all of this, but the end result was that the independence movement that Schomburg had been so involved with in the United States mostly came to an end. Cuba had become independent, although it was still occupied by U.S. troops. And many, but certainly not all, of the Puerto Rican community had started to focus more on cooperation with the U.S. rather than independence, and divisions started to really grow within that part of the movement.
The last meeting of the Puerto Rican section of the Cuban Revolutionary Party was held on August 2nd, 1898. And at that meeting, its members voted to dissolve it. Las Dos Antillas dissolved as well, and some of the people involved with these and other organizations returned to the Caribbean. Some, like Jose Marti, had already returned and had been killed in the uprising. But others remained in the U.S. and shifted their attention toward socialism, labor rights, or other social and political issues.
Schomburg shifted his attention some as well, and we will get to that after a sponsor break. After the end of the Spanish-Cuban-American War, Arturo Alfonso Schomburg turned more of his attention to looking for works by Black writers, artists, and historical figures from all over the world and collecting and documenting that work. This really wasn't new for him. He had studied and worked with numerous collectors and bibliophiles, many of whom were mostly self-taught like he was. And they were all collecting and documenting books and articles and artwork and other works that were related to their own lives and communities. Schomburg had a really good memory, and he had a knack for seeking out information, and he put that to use, trying to build a collection that would demonstrate the achievements of Black people all over the world.
At this point, this was not something that he could turn into a paying job, though. In 1901, he got a position as a clerk at a law office, and he told people that he was studying for the bar. But because of his lack of formal education, or at least the lack of any documentation of one, he was denied from taking it. On March 17, 1902, he got married again, this time to Elizabeth Morrow Taylor, a Black woman from North Carolina. They went on to have 2 children, Reginald Stanfield and Nathaniel Jose.
In 1905, Schomburg made a trip back to Puerto Rico and also visited the Dominican Republic. And in 1906, he was hired at Bankers Trust Company, and he would work there for more than 20 years. He started out as a messenger and worked his way up to being a supervisor of the Caribbean and Latin American mail section. Especially at the start of his career there, this job really didn't pay him very much. But it did give him enough money to buy books and documents and artwork for his collection. He also did some of his writing, because he wrote a lot, which we're going to talk more about in a bit. He did some of his writing and his collecting on company time, sometimes really to the annoyance of his own supervisors. He has some letters that he's written to friends that kind of read like, man, my boss will not get off my case because I'm trying to track down this book right now.
By the early 19-teens, Schomburg was becoming widely known in New York for that growing collection and his research into Black history. In 1911, he co-founded the Negro Society for Historical Research with journalist and Pan-Africanist John Edward Bruce, also known as Bruce Gritt. Bruce served as president, and Schomburg served as secretary and treasurer. Like Schomburg, Bruce was an autodidact. He had been enslaved from birth in 1856 and had largely educated himself after the U.S. Civil War.
According to its charter, the Negro Society for Historical Research was established, quote, to show that the Negro race has a history which antedates that of the proud Anglo-Saxon race. Although David Fulton was formally tapped to be the Society's librarian, Schomburg ultimately took on a lot of that work. Over the course of the society's existence, Schomburg collected about 300 volumes for its library. And when the society eventually disbanded, Schomburg folded those into his own collection, which was housed in his home, but was something that he made available for other people to use.
In July of 1913, Schomburg delivered a paper to the teacher's summer class at Cheyney Institute in Pennsylvania. That's now Cheyney University and is recognized as the oldest historically black college or university in the United States. This address was titled Racial Integrity, a plea for the establishment of a chair of Negro history in our schools and colleges, etc. It called for universities to have chairs of black history, just like for any other subject, and to adopt standards that included, quote, the practical history of the Negro race, from the dawn of civilization to the present time.
He went on in this address to walk through the contributions of various black writers and thinkers who were largely omitted from history texts, before continuing, quote, we need in the coming dawn the man who will give us the background for our future. It matters not whether he comes from the cloisters of the university or from the rank and file of the fields. We need the historian and philosopher to give us, with trenchant pen, the story of our forefathers, and let our soul and body, with phosphorescent light, brighten the chasm that separates us.
Schomburg saw all this knowledge about Black history as something that could uplift people of African descent all over the world. And his other work touched on that idea as well. Toward the end of World War II, he had some involvement in Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, although he was never formally a member. His work with Garvey included assisting him with historical research and doing translations between English and Spanish.
In 1914, John Wesley Cromwell and John Edward Bruce recommended Schomburg for membership in the American Negro Academy. The American Negro Academy was established in 1897 by John Wesley Cromwell, and its founding members included W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Laurence Dunbar. Its purpose was to produce and promote academic scholarship by and for Black people. Schomburg became its president in 1920, serving in that role until the Academy was disbanded in 1928.
Schomburg's leadership of the American Negro Academy was criticized by some of its members. The organization already seemed to be starting to wane when he became its president, but his light complexion and his Puerto Rican upbringing led some people to question whether he was Black enough to be there. John Edward Bruce had recommended him for membership, but when it came to his presidency, he described Schomburg as a, quote, half-breed who did not, quote, think Black.
Schomburg made a point to remind the rest of the Academy that there were Black people all over the world, not just in the United States, and that many were facing similar racism and oppression to what they experienced in the U.S., but that really just fed into perceptions that his attentions and his loyalties were to the Hispanic world and not to the Black community, which really was almost the opposite of the point that he was trying to make.
It didn't help that Schomburg had probably overcommitted himself by agreeing to become the Academy's president. He had become the master of his Masonic Lodge, which had been renamed as Prince Hall Lodge in 1914. This name change reflected a demographic shift. The Spanish-speaking membership of El Sol de Cuba had declined, and the lodge had boosted its numbers by recruiting more English-speaking Black members. Schomburg had personally translated the lodge's Spanish-language records and documents into English so that they would still be accessible to its members. He had also become Grand Secretary of the New York State Grand Lodge of the Prince Hall Masons, so between this, the Academy, his day job, and his collecting, which will remind you he also made his home publicly available, he had a whole lot on his plate.
Oh, yeah, and also he had gotten married for the third time in 1914 after the death of his second wife. His third wife was Elizabeth Green, and they went on to have 3 children together, Fernando Alfonso, Dolores Maria, and Carlos Placido. And yes, each of the 3 women he married was named Elizabeth.
In 1918, the Schomburgs moved to a house on what some people would call Kosciuszko Street. That street's name is apparently a matter of much debate.
Yes, I watched a whole video of New Yorkers disagreeing on how to say the name of it.
But in any case, it is in Brooklyn, and that became part home and part private library. Just in terms of people that we've talked about on the show before,